Imagine, if you will, the American landscape right at the turn of the 20th century.
Right. A very different world.
Completely.
Yeah.
Like, picture it not as the unified country we know today, but more as this vast, sprawling collection of, well, almost like isolated islands.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Islands.
We're talking about an era where rural communities were just deeply closed off,
Mm.
incredibly intimate and, largely self-contained.
You knew everyone.
Exactly. You knew your neighbors, you knew the local sheriff, and your world essentially ended at the county line.
If you even traveled that far.
Right. But then, quite suddenly, in the grand scheme of history, that closed-off world was just cracked wide open.
Violently opened, in a way.
Yeah, and the wedge that broke it apart wasn't like a philosophical movement or a government policy. It was iron. It was steam and wood.
The Transcontinental Railroad.
The railroad. And the sheer scale of that infrastructure explosion, it changed the very concept of human distance.
It really did, because, for thousands of years, the speed of human travel was capped by, what, the speed of a horse?
Literally just a horse.
Right. And then, virtually overnight, a journey across a state that would have taken, I don't know, weeks over rugged, dangerous terrain, suddenly it took a matter of days, or even hours.
It's mind-boggling when you think about the shift.
It was the physical birth of the interconnected modern age. You had these steel arteries pumping people and goods and, raw materials into the deepest, most untouched pockets of rural America.
And normally when we look back at that era, like in history class,
Mm.
we view that expansion as a triumph.
Oh, absolutely. The taming of the frontier.
The dawn of the industrial superpower, all of that.
Huh.
But our mission today for this deep dive is to look at the terrifying dark side of that exact same infrastructure.
Which is something people rarely talk about.
Almost never. We are going to reconstruct the criminology and the methodology of a transcontinental serial killer.
A truly horrifying concept for that time.
We are talking about a predator who looked at that new, expanding web of steel not as a way to build a nation, but as a predatory transit system.
Like his own personal hunting grid.
Yes, a killer who used this shiny new network to commit well over 100 murders. And incredibly, and this is the part that just gets me, he managed to remain entirely invisible to the law for over a century.
It's just, the premise alone is staggering, especially when you consider the logistics involved.
Right.
To think that a single individual could operate on that massive scale, constantly crossing state borders, infiltrating homes, and just slipping completely through the cracks of history.
Like a ghost.
Exactly like a ghost. It defies our whole modern understanding of how crime and punishment are supposed to work.
And to uncover how this was even possible, we are drawing from a truly groundbreaking synthesis of research today.
It really is.
Our core material is a book called The Man from the Train. It's an exhaustive historical and criminological analysis by researchers Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James.
Such incredible work by those two.
Truly. And we're also pulling from their supporting material, which includes archival court transcripts, early century census data, and localized historical data from the era.
And what the James have done here, it's nothing short of revolutionary in the field of historical criminology.
How so? Like, for people who aren't familiar.
Well, they didn't just dig up old, sensationalized newspaper clippings to tell a spooky story.
Right.
They applied a rigorous, highly quantitative, almost scientific methodology to raw data that had just been sitting there, dormant in county archives for over 100 years.
Wow.
They essentially pioneered a new way of looking at historical crime.
And that actually leads me to a really important point about our focus today. I want to explicitly state to you, listening right now, we are bypassing the usual true crime sensationalism here.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
We aren't here for the cheap thrills or the gruesome spectacle of early 1900s murder. We are going to focus intensely on the how and the why.
The mechanics of it all.
Exactly. This is a forensic breakdown of a killer's incredibly specific modus operandi, his MO. We're going to examine his psychopathology, the biomechanics of his methods, and crucially, the systemic structural failures of 19th and 20th century policing that allowed him to operate with absolute impunity.
Because the system totally failed.
Totally. So
Yeah.
let's unpack this. Before we can even begin to understand the physical mechanics of how this killer actually committed his crimes, We first have to understand how modern statistical criminology finally detected his invisible web.
Right, because back in 1905, he was quite literally a ghost. No one knew he existed.
So to understand that invisibility, we really have to immerse ourselves in the localized nature of early 1900 law enforcement.
It's incredibly difficult for us living in the information age to grasp just how fragmented policing actually was back then.
I mean, there was no FBI, right?
No FBI. There was no centralized fingerprint database. There was no national wire service that routinely shared granular, specific crime scene details between jurisdictions.
Yeah.
If you were a sheriff in a small town in Kansas, your jurisdiction was your entire universe.
So, okay, let's say a horrific family murder happens in a rural farmhouse in Maine. And a month later, a nearly identical family murder happens in a farmhouse in Texas.
Those two sheriffs are operating in completely different realities.
Completely different realities. They just view them as entirely isolated local tragedies.
Right, because if a family was wiped out in Maine, the local sheriff automatically looked for a local suspect.
Because why wouldn't they?
Exactly. The assumption was always that violence of that magnitude stems from local, intimate conflict.
Like a crime of passion.
Yeah. So they look for a disgruntled neighbor or a jilted lover or, I don't know, a farmhand who got fired and held a grudge.
Someone with a clear motive.
Right. And when a similar crime happened in Texas a month later, the Texas sheriff did the exact same thing within his own town.
Right, looking for the local Texas farmhand with a grudge.
Exactly. The cognitive leap required to suggest that a transient stranger rode a train from Maine to Texas just to commit the same random act of violence.
Unimaginable.
It was. That idea was inconceivable to the law enforcement paradigms of the time.
It's the ultimate jurisdictional blind spot. The killer is playing a macro game on a continental board, and the police are playing a micro game in their own backyards.
Which is exactly why traditional police work never caught him, never even came close.
So, to finally find this killer, a century later, Bill and Rachel McCarthy James had to use a methodology that would have been, honestly, total science fiction to early 20th century policing.
Oh, absolutely.
They used an approach remarkably similar to sabermetrics.
Yes, sabermetrics.
Now, sabermetrics, for those who might not follow baseball, is the empirical, statistical analysis of baseball records. It was famously popularized by Bill James himself, actually.
Right, Moneyball, essentially.
Yes, Moneyball. It's about looking past the obvious traditional stats like batting average and mining the deep data to find hidden patterns and undervalued metrics that actually predict how a game is won.
But how on earth do you apply baseball statistics to historical axe murders? That sounds crazy.
It sounds totally discordant, but the underlying mathematical philosophy is identical.
How so?
You let the data reveal the patterns, rather than letting human assumptions dictate the narrative.
Right.
What they did was apply that exact same statistical rigor to a massive cache of historical murder data. They systematically analyzed approximately 250 family mass murders that occurred across the United States between 1890 and 1920.
250 family murders. That's a huge data set.
It is. But the initial goal wasn't even to find a serial killer. The goal was to establish a mathematical baseline.
Right, a control group.
Exactly. They needed to answer a fundamental question. What does a standard domestic homicide actually look like in this specific era?
Because if you don't know what normal looks like, you can't mathematically identify the abnormal.
Right, so what did the baseline look like in the data?
Well, the historical data showed that the United States averaged about 8 multiple victim family murders per year during that 30-year window.
8 a year, okay.
And those standard baseline murders almost always had clear, understandable, traceable motives.
Right.
They stemmed from extreme domestic disputes, inheritance conflicts, maybe a documented, long-standing local animosity over property lines that finally boiled over into violence.
Things you could track.
Yes. Or, very commonly, they were robberies gone wrong.
So it's the tragic but logically understandable human element.
Yeah.
Someone wanted money, or someone was consumed by local rage.
Exactly. But within that massive data set of 250 murders, by applying statistical filters and looking purely at behavioral clusters, the researchers isolated a very specific, highly anomalous subset of crimes.
Okay, anomalous how?
Well, these were crimes that completely lacked those standard baseline motives.
No motives at all.
None that made sense locally. There was absolutely no robbery. Valuables were left right out in plain sight.
Oh, wow.
There was no local dispute. The victims were universally liked in their communities.
Okay, so if it's not robbery and it's not revenge, What is it?
What they did share was an incredibly elaborate, highly specific set of ritualistic signatures left at the crime scene.
Ah, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because they didn't just say, oh, these 10 cases look kind of similar.
No, no, far more scientific than that.
Right. They essentially built a rigid, tiered Bayesian probability model based on 30 distinct signatures.
30 incredibly specific behavioral data points. We are talking about things far more granular than just, the weapon used.
Like what?
We are talking about the specific positioning of the bodies, the manipulation of light sources in the home, the proximity of the house to a very specific type of rail junction, the treatment of reflective surfaces in the room.
It's so meticulous. So let's break down how this mathematical model actually works for the listener. At the very top, what they call the 100% probability tier, they isolated 59 victims across 14 different families.
14 distinct massacres.
Yeah. And we're talking about a geographic spread that is just mind-boggling for the time. Massachusetts, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Illinois, Kansas, Colorado, Iowa.
All over the map.
Literally. And the researchers argue that every single one of these 14 family massacres featured all 30 of these bizarre signatures.
Which is, just think about the statistical improbability of that occurring by chance.
Right. Break that math down.
Okay, so if a killer covers the mirrors in a house, which is rare, let's say that happens in 1% of homicides.
Okay.
And let's say a killer removing the chimney from a kerosene lamp happens in 0.5% of homicides.
Right.
The mathematical probability of two entirely unconnected local killers in different states independently deciding to do both of those highly specific, bizarre things.
Microscopic.
Exactly. While also using the exact same blunt force trauma technique and also leaving all the money on the table, the probability drops to near zero.
It's like looking at a scatter plot of 1,000 random dots on a graph.
Yeah, just noise.
Right. For a century, local historians just looked at their one dot and saw an isolated tragedy. But suddenly, you apply this specific algorithmic filter, and you realize a whole sequence of those dots actually forms a perfect, deliberate, mathematical curve across the entire country.
It's a constellation hiding in plain sight.
But wait, I have to push back here, because this is where my mind immediately goes when we talk about wide-ranging historical crimes, and I'm sure the listeners thinking this too.
Sure, go ahead.
We know newspapers back then were heavily sensationalized, right? They loved that penny dreadful style gore.
Oh, they thrived on it.
So if these similar crimes are popping up across the country over a decade, how can we be absolutely mathematically sure this isn't just a copycat phenomenon?
A copycat.
Yeah, like someone in Illinois reads a highly dramatic newspaper report about an axe murder in Texas and decides to recreate it in their own town.
That is the crucial question, and it's the very first vulnerability any modern criminologist would look for in this kind of data. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the era's media landscape, the primitive nature of early 1900s communication actually serves as a firewall that rules out the copycat theory.
Okay, explain the mechanism there. Why wouldn't a copycat work?
Because of the editorial standards of the time, the specific, highly bizarre rituals at these crime scenes, the 30 signatures that make up the probability model, were almost never printed in full detail in the local or national papers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, the press of the day would absolutely report the gore, the tragedy, the shock of a family wiped out.
Blood on the walls, that kind of stuff.
Right. They'd print a massive headline in bold letters about the demon Axeman or whatever, but they generally considered the deeply weird, psychosexual, ritualistic staging of the bodies and the environment to be far too profane to print in a family paper.
Ah, Victorian sensibilities.
Exactly. Or in many cases, the local reporters simply didn't understand the psychological significance of the staging.
Because profiling wasn't a thing yet.
Right, so they deemed those details irrelevant to the story and just left them out completely.
Oh, I see. So a prospective copycat sitting in Illinois, reading the Chicago Tribune, wouldn't even know how to copy the crime accurately.
Precisely. They might read that an axe was used, sure, but they wouldn't read that the mirror was draped with an apron, or that a specific type of lamp was manipulated in a highly specific way.
Wow.
Yet, these incredibly obscure, unpublished signatures appeared perfectly replicated across thousands of miles. A copycat simply did not have access to the source code of the crime.
The data was siloed.
The data was completely siloed at the crime scenes themselves.
That is genuinely chilling. It means the only possible common denominator transmitting that information from a house in Texas to a house in Illinois was the mind of the man holding the weapon.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for the investigation? It means we've mathematically isolated a single, hyper-prolific perpetrator.
One man.
One man. And the model suggests an estimated victim count of over 100 people when you factor in the lower probability tiers that account for spotty early reporting.
Over 100.
If true, we are looking at someone who rivals or even exceeds modern offenders like Samuel Little, but operating in an era of horse-drawn carriages and steam trains.
Which is an insane logistical feat.
Right. And that naturally forces us to ask, what kind of human being possesses the physical, logistical, and psychological capability to execute something on this massive transcontinental scale?
To answer that, we really have to profile what criminologists might call the traveling stranger.
Okay, the traveling stranger.
We have to look at the demographics of the transient workforce of the era, and the prime suspect that emerges from this historical deep dive, the man whose movements align almost perfectly with the geographic data points, is a man named Paul Mueller.
Paul Mueller, a German immigrant and an itinerant lumberjack.
Yes, and he first appears on the historical radar not as a transcontinental mastermind, but as a primary suspect in a very early localized case.
Which one was that?
The 1898 murder of the Newton family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts.
Okay, so what happened there?
He had actually been hired by the family as a farmhand shortly before they were killed, so his name was known to the local authorities in that one specific instance.
Okay, so let's talk about the physical reality of this man, because his physicality is vital to understanding the biomechanics of how he operated.
Absolutely.
According to the 1898 manhunt records, which the researchers miraculously dug up, he was in his mid-30s at the time, described as short, perhaps around 5'3" or 5'4", but immensely, powerfully muscular.
Built like a tank.
Built like a tank, yeah. And there's this one detail from the wanted posters that I just can't shake. It's so creepy.
Teeth.
Yes. He was noted for having unusually small, widely spaced teeth.
Now, that physical detail might seem trivial at first glance, but in the context of criminal profiling, it's highly significant.
Why is that?
Well, whether it was a congenital abnormality or the result of severe dental decay, it added to his overall aura of profound strangeness. Witnesses and employers consistently described him as socially awkward to the point of being repellent. Deeply sullen and completely devoid of charm.
He also spoke very broken English, right? Which would have isolated him even further from the communities he drifted through.
Exactly. Which brings us to the sociological aspect of his profile. Paul Mueller lived entirely on the extreme margins of society.
He was a total outsider.
And from a criminological standpoint, this is the paramount factor in his century of invisibility.
Invisibility cloak.
Right. He completely lacked the interpersonal connections that almost always betray serial offenders.
Explain that, because I think people assume serial killers are usually caught by forensic evidence.
Often they are. But when modern police investigate a serial killer, they aren't just looking for DNA, they are looking for behavioral leakage.
Behavioral leakage. Okay, what does that look like?
They look for someone whose spouse notices they are unaccountably absent during the hours of a murder.
Where were you at 3 a.m.?
Exactly. They look for a roommate who notices bloody clothing in the laundry. They look for someone who exhibits sudden, agitated behavioral changes at work the next day.
Right. Normal people notice when someone acts like they just killed a family.
But Paul Mueller had no spouse. He had no roommates. He had no friends. There was absolutely no one in his life to notice that he was missing or acting strangely or traveling inexplicably.
He was a sociological phantom.
He was entirely untethered.
And his occupation was the absolute perfect cover for that untethered lifestyle, right? Because being an itinerant lumberjack provided him with literally everything he needed to execute this transcontinental spree.
It was an ecosystem perfectly suited to a predator.
Right,
First and foremost, it gave him a legitimate, unquestioned reason to be constantly transient.
Right, because of the timber boom?
Yes. The expanding rail and timber industries required massive amounts of cheap, mobile labor. Moving from a timber camp in Maine to a rail expansion in Colorado was completely normalized behavior for a man of his demographic.
Right, if you see a grimy guy in rugged clothes walking along the train tracks in 1905, you don't think, oh my God, a serial killer. You think, oh, a lumberjack looking for the next camp.
It's an invisibility cloak made of sheer mundanity.
Wow.
Second, The labor itself fundamentally shaped his physical capability.
With physical strength.
We mentioned he was short but immensely muscular. The specific type of labor a lumberjack performs, swinging a heavy felling axe for 10 to 12 hours a day, it develops incredible rotational core strength and upper body power.
He was functionally incredibly strong.
Yes. And third, the job gave him an unparalleled professional proficiency with woodworking tools.
Right.
To Paul Mueller, an axe wasn't an improvised weapon. It was an extension of his own arm. It was the instrument he controlled better than anything else in the world.
Think about the vulnerability of the public at that time. Like, think about how you, the listener, feel walking alone through an empty, unlit train station late at night today.
It's unsettling.
You might feel a bit on edge, but you know there are cameras. You have a cell phone in your pocket, police can be there in 3 minutes.
You have a safety net.
Exactly. Now imagine that feeling of isolation, but you are sleeping in a farmhouse. There is no phone. The nearest sheriff is a 3-day ride away.
You are completely on your own.
Completely. But more importantly, the psychological concept of a stranger danger didn't exist in the same way back then.
Not at all.
You lock your door because you had an argument with the blacksmith down the road over a debt. You don't lock your door because an invisible transient might step off a freight train at 2 a.m., walk 3 miles in the dark to your house, and leave on the 4 a.m. train.
That threat matrix just did not exist in the public consciousness.
It was a vulnerability born of profound societal innocence. The physical infrastructure of the nation evolved faster than the psychological defenses of its citizens.
And Mueller recognized that gap and exploited it flawlessly.
Which means we need to talk about his tactical execution. Because understanding his background as an invisible transient explains how he moved across the map, but the sheer volume of his crimes, the fact that he successfully breached over 100 homes without ever being caught in the act, that requires a deep dive into his specific approach.
It requires extreme tactical precision.
Yeah. How does an outsider actually acquire a target in a town he's never been to?
The data reveals a terrifyingly methodical process. He used the railroad not just as a means of conveyance, but as an elevated observation deck.
He was scouting from the train.
Exactly. He specifically targeted small rural towns that had minimal or completely non-existent dedicated police forces. But the most vital geographic signature, the key to his logistical success, was proximity.
Proximity to the tracks.
He almost exclusively chose homes that were within a moderate walking distance of a rail junction or a slow-grade section of track.
Because that proximity was his extraction plan.
Exactly. Think about it. If he targeted a house 10 miles from the tracks, he would need to steal a horse or hire a wagon to escape before sunrise.
And stealing a horse is a huge deal back then.
The massive deal. It leaves a massive evidentiary trail and invites an immediate local posse. Hiring a wagon requires human interaction and leaves a witness.
Right.
But by keeping the target within walking distance, he maintained complete operational independence. He could commit the crime, walk 2 miles in the dark, and physically hop onto a slow-moving freight train hauling timber or coal before the town even woke up.
But wait, stop right there. Let's look at the logistics of this. Because he doesn't just hop off a train at midnight, pick the first house he sees with the lights off, and walk through the front door. The pre-attack surveillance phase that the Jameses outline in the book is insane.
It is the hallmark of a highly organized, deeply psychopathic predator.
What was he doing?
The killer would actively seek out properties that featured specific architectural vulnerabilities.
Like what?
Primarily, he looked for homes that had outbuildings, specifically barns or large sheds, that offered a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the main house.
Huh.
And once he found that vantage point, he would infiltrate the barn and hide.
And not just for a few minutes.
No, not for a few minutes to catch his breath. The evidence suggests he hid in these outbuildings for hours, and in some cases, for days.
Okay, logistically make it make sense. How does a man hide in a stranger's barn for 2 days? What about food? What about the farmers coming in every morning and evening to feed the horses or milk the cows? How is he not sneezing or coughing or just being spotted by a farmhand?
It requires a level of predatory discipline that is genuinely difficult for a normal human to fathom.
It sounds impossible.
He would secret himself in haylofts or behind large implements, areas rarely disturbed by daily chores. As for sustenance, he likely brought minimal scraps with him or simply went hungry.
Just starved himself in the dark.
Fueled entirely by the adrenaline and the dark anticipation of the event. He was perfectly still, perfectly silent. He was essentially a wildlife predator, studying the watering hole, mapping every nuance of his prey's ecosystem.
So what exactly is he watching for during those 48 hours in the dark?
He is meticulously observing the family's routine. He's noting how many adults live there. He's watching the windows at night to deduce the floor plan.
Ah, who sleeps where?
Right. Who sleeps in which room, when the lanterns are finally extinguished, when the deepest quiet finally settles over the property, and crucially, above all else, he is ensuring there's no dog on the property.
Because a dog ruins everything.
A dog is the ultimate chaotic variable in a stealth infiltration.
Right.
A dog doesn't care how quietly you walk. A dog smells a stranger, barks frantically, wakes the adult male of the house, and completely destroys the killer's tactical advantage of surprise.
It's an alarm system.
Exactly. And in analyzing the dozens of confirmed cases, the researchers noted a glaring absence. Almost none of the targeted homes had an indoor dog.
Which proves the surveillance phase wasn't just him resting in a barn. He was actively filtering targets.
Yes.
He didn't just get lucky 100 times and happen to pick homes without dogs. He knew.
He was selecting them.
Right. And his strike window, the time he finally decided to leave the barn and approach the house, was incredibly specific. It was always between midnight and 5 a.m.
From a physiological standpoint, that window is no accident whatsoever.
Why?
He was specifically targeting the period of deepest human REM sleep.
Okay, let's explore the physiology of that, because it explains so much about how he moved through these old, creaky wooden houses without waking anyone up. What happens to the human body at 3 a.m. that makes it so vulnerable?
During the deepest stages of the sleep cycle, particularly delta wave sleep and REM sleep, the human body undergoes profound physiological changes.
Like what?
Your auditory arousal threshold, which is the volume of noise required to wake you up, peaks.
Okay.
So a floorboard creaking or a door latch clicking, which would instantly alert you at 10 p.m., simply does not register in the brain at 3 a.m.
Your brain just ignores it.
Furthermore, during REM sleep, the body essentially paralyzes itself.
Wait, really?
Yes, it's a state called muscle atonia. It happens to prevent you from acting out your dreams, so you are biologically incapacitated.
Huh.
Mueller understood this rhythm intimately. He waited until his victims were chemically and biologically paralyzed by their own sleep cycles before he ever crossed the threshold.
That is just terrifying.
It's incredibly calculating.
But I have to ask, is this level of immense patience like sitting in a freezing barn for 48 hours, suppressing every physical need just to watch a family? Is that unusual for a killer motivated by the kind of horrific up-close violence we see in these cases?
Highly unusual.
Because usually when we think of axe murders, we think of a sudden explosion of uncontrollable rage, like a crime of passion.
It is highly unusual, and it's what separates him from the vast majority of historical killers.
Right.
Most offenders who operate with such devastating intimate violence are classified as disorganized.
Disorganized offenders, okay.
They are driven by frenzy, panic, or sudden impulse. And because of that, they leave chaotic, messy scenes full of mistakes and evidence.
They drop things, they leave footprints in blood.
Exactly. What's fascinating about Mueller is the sheer, cold-blooded discipline required to delay his own gratification. His ability to endure physical discomfort in a barn for days speaks to a deeply organized, profoundly psychopathic personality.
The violence wasn't a sudden loss of emotional control.
No, not at all. It was the final, inevitable step of a highly structured project.
And once that project moved indoors, once he finally stepped out of the barn and slipped inside the home, the methodology shifts instantly. From passive, silent surveillance to devastating, horrific efficiency.
The execution phase.
Right. Let's talk about the instrument and the execution. Because this is perhaps the most defining and chilling element of his MO. The killer almost never brought his own weapon to the crime scene.
That's correct. He utilized a weapon of opportunity.
He used the family's own axe. He would just find it at the wood pile outside the kitchen door or grab it from the barn where he had been hiding. He brought absolutely nothing with him.
If we analyze the forensic pragmatism of that specific decision, it is brilliant in a very dark, tactical way.
How so?
Imagine the logistics of his lifestyle. He relies on public transit freight trains.
Right.
If he is walking from the train yard to a rural house at 1 a.m. and a local night watchman or a late-night traveler stops him, what does he have on him?
Nothing.
Nothing. He has no contraband. He's just a transient looking for work.
He's innocent until proven otherwise.
Exactly. But if he brought his own weapon, he'd be carrying a heavy, incredibly conspicuous, and potentially blood-stained axe across state lines.
Which is an insane liability.
Immense liability.
Yeah.
By sourcing the weapon at the scene and leaving it at the scene, he maintained absolute physical neutrality while in transit.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But the way he used the axe, this is the biomechanical detail that is so dark, but so telling of his background.
The blunt edge.
Right. Because when we think of an axe murder, we think of a chopping motion.
Yeah.
We think of the sharp blade. But he didn't use the blade. The evidence shows he almost exclusively used the blunt, flat head of the axe, the backside of the tool.
Yes. Criminologists refer to this as the blunt edge MO.
But why? I mean, structurally, an axe is designed to cut. It has a sharpened edge for a reason. Why would a killer take a deadly sharp tool and flip it around?
It's a chilling twist of physical logic that perfectly aligns with his occupational background as a lumberjack.
Okay, break that down.
Let's look at the physics and the biology of it. If you use the sharp edge of an axe on a human body, it creates a massive, deep slicing wound that immediately breaches the cardiovascular system.
It cuts the arteries?
Arteries are severed. The result is an immense, highly pressurized spray of arterial blood.
And if you were standing over a bed swinging an axe, that blood spray is going to cover your arms, your torso, your pants.
It gets everywhere. It gets on the walls, but crucially, it gets all over the killer's clothes. And remember, Paul Mueller is a transient. He doesn't have a washing machine. He doesn't have a hotel room where he can clean up.
He's living in boxcars.
He cannot easily wash or replace a blood-soaked wardrobe while living on the run and riding in freight cars. Walking into a train yard covered in arterial spray is a death sentence.
So the blunt edge is a forensic countermeasure.
Yes, but it's also a tactical choice.
How so?
A sharp edge, when swung with massive force into a human skull, can get wedged in the bone.
Ouch.
It takes intense physical effort and leverage to pull it out, which costs precious seconds and creates horrifying noise.
Right, it wakes people up.
But the blunt flathead, it maximizes catastrophic blunt force trauma. A single, incredibly powerful strike to the cranium with the heavy blunt end causes instant, devastating incapacitation.
They don't even wake up.
The victims, especially the adult males who posed the only physical threat, couldn't cry out, couldn't fight back, couldn't even wake up. And crucially, blunt trauma crushes inward. It shatters the bone, but often contains much of the massive hemorrhage within the cavity, drastically minimizing the exterior blood spray on his clothes.
Wow. Okay, so we are talking about a lumberjack, a man who swings an axe for a living. He knows exactly how the weight is distributed. He knows the physics of the swing, the arc, the kinetic energy required.
He's an expert.
But using the blunt side in the dark confines of a low-ceilinged 1900s bedroom,
Oh,
it's a profound perversion of his daily trade.
it really is.
It's the difference between the hard labor of chopping wood and the hyper-efficient clinical execution of a human being.
That is an incredibly accurate distinction. It was a clinical, calculated, biomechanical procedure designed to neutralize threats instantly.
And when the execution of the adults was over, he was just as methodical with the disposal of the tool, right?
Yes, he wouldn't just drop the axe. He would meticulously wipe it clean of blood and his own fingerprints, often using the victim's own bedclothes or a towel from the kitchen. And then he would leave the axe in plain sight, often leaning perfectly upright against the bedroom wall or sitting prominently on the kitchen table.
It's like a gesture of supreme defiance, a theatrical signature left for whoever found the house the next morning.
Whether he intended it as a taunt to the police or merely a psychological period at the end of his violent sentence, it functioned as his calling card.
But here is where we have to look deeper into the terrifying psychopathology of the man. Because the clinical execution of the adults, the parents sleeping in the home, that actually wasn't his primary goal.
No, it wasn't.
The adults were merely an obstacle, a
That's right.
prerequisite. The deepest, most disturbing insights into Mueller's criminology come from what he did after the adults were dead and the house was quiet.
This brings us to the core psychosexual motive driving the entire transcontinental enterprise.
The real reason he was there.
The immense logistical risk, the train hopping, the days of freezing surveillance, the clinical murders of the adults, all of it was a mechanism to fulfill a sadistic, pedophilic attraction to prepubescent girls.
And the forensic evidence of the crime scenes, as analyzed by the researchers, bears this out in a truly tragic way, doesn't it?
It does. While the adults were almost always killed instantly in their sleep with a single, devastating, blunt force blow to the head, the children in the home, particularly the young girls, often showed extensive defensive wounds.
Which means they woke up.
They woke up, they fought back.
Which tells us everything about his pacing. The hyper-efficient clinical speed disappeared once the threat of the adult male was neutralized. He took his time in the children's rooms.
It's awful to think about.
And we know definitively that this violence wasn't a byproduct of a robbery gone wrong because, as we mentioned earlier, the financial data is stark.
No money, no silver, no jewelry was ever taken.
Right. In several cases, purses overflowing with cash were sitting right on the kitchen table, completely untouched.
So we have to look at the highly ritualized staging that occurred post-mortem, because this is the behavioral fingerprint that links a murder in a logging town in Oregon to a farming community in Iowa.
The staging.
Once the violence was finally over, he didn't just run out the back door, he stayed. And he engaged in massive, bizarre environmental manipulation.
One of the most consistent and eerie signatures across the data set was his treatment of the physical space, right?
Yes. He would systematically cover the windows and the mirrors from the inside.
Like, he would go through the house, taking the family's own linens, bath towels, kitchen aprons, even articles of clothing from the closets.
Anything he could find.
And he would painstakingly drape them over every single reflective surface and every window pane in the rooms where he operated.
Now, I know criminologists debate the purpose of this specific behavior. Some suggest it was purely practical, that he was going to light a lantern, and he needed to hide the lamplight from any insomniac neighbors so no one would get suspicious.
A blackout curtain, basically.
Exactly, but others argue it was a much deeper psychological barrier. He was isolating his theater.
His theater.
He didn't want the outside world looking in, and perhaps more importantly, he didn't want to catch sight of his own reflection in a mirror while surrounded by what he had done.
I tend to agree with the psychological interpretation, or at least a synthesis of both, because covering mirrors is a recognized phenomenon in disorganized homicides, right? Often stemming from shame or dissociation from the reality of the act.
Right, but here, in a highly organized offender, it seems to serve as a way to completely seal the environment. It made the house entirely exclusively his domain.
A sensory deprivation cocoon where he controlled absolutely everything.
Yes, and he extended this morbid shrouding to the victims themselves. Following the murders, the victims' faces and heads were almost always covered with sheets, pillows, or blankets.
It's so unsettling.
In some of the more elaborate cases, he would physically move the bodies from their original beds and stack them or pose them in specific ritualistic configurations.
And then there's the kerosene lamp. This is the one detail that just haunts me above all the others. It's so specific.
The lamp chimney.
Yeah. He would find a standard kerosene lamp in the home. He would manually remove the glass chimney, that fragile, bulbous glass part that protects the open flame and directs the oxygen draft.
Very carefully.
And he would carefully, gently place that glass chimney on the floor so it wouldn't break. Then he would take the exposed flame and turn the wick down.
To understand the significance of that, you have to understand the physics of a 1900s kerosene lamp. Removing the chimney fundamentally changes how the flame behaves.
Oh, so?
Without the draft protection, the flame burns erratically. It flickers wildly, it produces thick black smoke, and it emits a very dim, focused, almost subterranean orange light.
A creepy, dim light.
It casts deep, terrifying, dancing shadows against the walls.
Imagine the psychology of this man. He removes the lamp chimney specifically to alter the lighting of the room. He creates a macabre spotlight.
He's setting the mood.
It's not a crime scene to him. It's a stage play where he is the director, the audience, and the star. And he fully intends to occupy that domestic space for hours. What is the fact that he leaves all the valuables untouched and spends hours in the middle of the night manipulating the light, covering the mirrors, and posing the bodies? Tell us about the internal reward he was getting.
It tells us the reward was purely 100% intrinsic.
Intrinsic, meaning internal.
He wasn't stealing gold to survive. He was murdering to experience absolute power and total control over human life. Taking a few dollars from a purse doesn't feed the massive psychological deficit that drove him across a continent.
Right, that's meaningless to him.
The staging, the lingering in the house, the complete unadulterated domination of the domestic sanctuary, that was the payment. He was drinking in the atmosphere he had painstakingly created.
It's just evil, pure evil.
And when he finally had his fill, when the psychological tension was resolved, his exit strategy was just as calculated as his entrance.
He jammed the doors from the outside.
Yes. Upon leaving the house to walk back to the train tracks, he would frequently secure the perimeter behind him.
How did he do that?
He would jam the doors shut, sometimes tightly wedging a piece of wood or a heavy porch chair under the exterior doorknob. Or, if the door had a keyhole, he would lock it from the outside and take the key with him.
Just to delay discovery. To buy himself a few extra crucial hours.
Every hour mattered.
Because if a neighbor comes by at 8 a.m. to borrow some sugar and the door is jammed, They might just think the family is sleeping in or out back, and they walk away.
Right.
That gives Mueller an extra 4 hours on a freight train, putting another 100 miles between him and the crime scene before the local sheriff is even notified.
It was a brilliantly simple temporal buffer, and time again, decade after decade, it worked.
Which brings us to the fallout. The trail of blood, bias, and the final escapes. Because Mueller's flawless execution of this MO didn't exist in a pristine laboratory vacuum.
No, it existed in the real world.
It intersected fatally with the deep societal biases of the era, and it left a secondary trail of absolute tragedy in his wake.
If we track the geographic escalation mapped out by the researchers, the timeline is deeply unsettling. We see the 1904 murders in Statesboro, Georgia. Then, as he perfects his methodology, we see a massive escalation in 1911 in Colorado Springs.
The double event.
Yes, where he committed a double event, infiltrating 2 separate homes and killing 2 entire families who lived across the street from each other on the exact same night.
Which is when the national press finally started to take notice.
Right.
They couldn't ignore a double family annihilation, so they started dubbing this phantom suspect Billy the Axeman.
Right. And then, of course, the timeline culminates in 1912 with the most infamous unsolved crime in early American history.
The Villisca Axe murders.
The Villisca Axe murders in Iowa, where 8 people, including 2 young house guests who just happened to be sleeping over, were slaughtered in a single night.
But we have to look at what happened in the towns after Mueller hopped his freight train and disappeared. The institutionalization of bias.
It's a dark chapter.
As we discussed earlier, local police simply couldn't fathom a transcontinental killer. So when a small town woke up and found a wiped-out family, they panicked.
Complete hysteria.
The community demanded immediate blood, and the local authorities, desperate for a scapegoat and blinded by their own prejudices, always, inevitably, targeted the lowest person on the social hierarchy.
It is a tragic, repeating pattern of systemic failure. The inability of the local power structures to comprehend the true external nature of the threat caused communities to turn violently on their most vulnerable, marginalized members.
The historical records show that at least 11 completely innocent people were lynched or officially executed by the state for Paul Mueller's crimes.
11 innocent lives destroyed by community panic.
And the racial dynamics of this scapegoating are horrifying, but historically undeniable.
Especially in the Jim Crow South.
Right. In the Jim Crow South, the blame was immediate and lethal. In Statesboro, Georgia, after the 1904 murders of the Hodges family, the white community formed a mob. 2 black men, Paul Reed and Will Cato, were dragged out and burned alive by that mob, despite having absolutely zero connection to the crime.
None.
2 years later, after the Lyerly family was murdered in Barber Junction, North Carolina, 3 innocent black men were lynched by a white mob in retaliation.
Sickening to read about.
It really is. And the scapegoating wasn't limited just to racial minorities. It targeted anyone who didn't fit into the rigid social norm.
Like in Villisca.
Exactly. In Villisca, Iowa, the police zeroed in on a mentally ill, highly eccentric traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly.
They ruined his life.
They relentlessly interrogated him, psychologically coerced a confession out of him, and subjected him to multiple trials, essentially ruining his life, even though juries eventually acquitted him because the physical evidence entirely cleared him.
If we look at this sociologically, the killer's real weapon wasn't just the blunt edge of the axe, it was his implicit, predatory understanding of society's blind spots.
Yes. That is exactly it. He weaponized our assumptions.
He weaponized the local bigotry.
He knew, consciously or subconsciously, that if you walked away cleanly and left no physical trail, the town's own internal prejudices would provide the perfect smokescreen.
The town would destroy itself looking for the killer.
The local police would be so busy forming posses to hang the local outcast or interrogate the town eccentric that they wouldn't even think to go down to the rail yard and check the freight train schedules.
Structural bigotry actively, tangibly protected a serial killer.
It's a profound insight into the era. He thrived not just because he was cunning, but because the society he attacked was structurally and psychologically incapable of looking beyond its own local prejudices.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
But then suddenly, the American spree just ends. The data points stop. After the massive heat of the Villisca murders in late 1912, the trail goes completely cold.
Which leads the researchers to propose a highly compelling, if terrifying, theory: the German translocation.
The German translocation.
After Villisca, the national press was finally putting the pieces together. The Billy the Axeman pattern was front-page news across the country. Mueller, who we know was highly disciplined and observant, likely realized the window of absolute anonymity was finally closing.
He knew the cops were waking up.
The American authorities were starting to wake up, so he utilized his ultimate advantage,
Yeah.
his mobility. He fled. He went back across the Atlantic to his home country, Germany.
And this is where this historical deep dive intersects with one of the most famous, heavily debated, unsolved mysteries in European history.
The 1922 Hinterkaifeck massacre in Bavaria.
Let's break the details of Hinterkaifeck down because the parallels are staggering.
They really are.
March 31st, 1922. The Gruber family and their new maid are slaughtered on an incredibly isolated rural farmstead in the Bavarian woods.
A very familiar setting.
The weapon used: a mattock, which is essentially a heavy agricultural tool with a flat, heavy blade, incredibly similar in weight and biomechanics to a felling axe.
The blunt force trauma.
The killer lured the adults to the barn, killed them one by one, and then, just like Mueller did in America, the killer lived inside the farmhouse with the bodies for days, feeding the cattle and eating the family's food.
The signature overlap between Hinterkaifeck and the American dataset is uncanny. Let's look at the surveillance phase.
What happened before the murders?
In the months leading up to the Hinterkaifeck massacre, the Gruber family reported profoundly unsettling events. They found strange footprints in the deep snare leading from the dense woods to the farm, but no footprints leading back out.
Oh, that's creepy.
They heard heavy footsteps in the attic above their bedrooms at night. They found an unfamiliar newspaper on their property.
That is Mueller's exact, agonizingly slow surveillance and intrusion tactic.
The barn hiding, he was living in their attic, watching them.
Exactly. He was mapping the ecosystem.
Furthermore, we see the economic signature perfectly replicated. There were massive sums of cash, gold coins, and valuables found in the Hinterkaifeck house, totally untouched by the killer. Absolute lack of robbery.
And tragically, fitting the specific psychosexual profile of the man from the train, one of the victims was a young girl, Cecilia, who forensic evidence showed survived the initial blunt force attack and suffered for hours in the barn, tearing her own hair out in terror.
Which aligns perfectly with the sadistic, prolonged focus he placed on female children in the American cases.
The Janeses assign a 40% probability to the Hinterkaifeck killer being Paul Mueller. Now, 40% might not sound like a smoking gun, but in the realm of century-old historical true crime, bridging two continents, that statistical correlation is highly significant.
But it's massive.
It suggests a horrifying narrative, that he went back to Germany, waited out the meat grinder of the First World War, and then found the social chaos, extreme poverty, and rural isolation of post-war Bavaria to be fertile, familiar ground to resume his highly specific brand of horror.
It's a deeply chilling conclusion, but logically it is incredibly sound. A true psychopathic predator driven by intrinsic psychological needs doesn't just spontaneously stop.
Right.
They stop when they are forced to, either by incarceration, death, or a complete loss of physical capability. Or they radically change their environment to keep the predation going. Mueller simply changed his hunting ground to maintain his invisibility.
Okay, we need to zoom out and look at the massive picture we've unpacked here today.
Yeah, let's zoom out.
The story of Paul Mueller, the man from the train, isn't just a story about a man with an axe. It is a fundamental story about how a single, highly adaptable predator exploited the unseen seams of a rapidly changing world.
The seams of progress.
A perfect storm of rapid industrial expansion, the limitless mobility of the railroads, coupled with severely localized, uncommunicative policing, societal bigotry, and a chillingly perfected, biomechanically efficient MO, allowed him to turn the ultimate domestic sanctuary into a slaughterhouse across an entire continent.
He was the dark passenger of American progress. He rode the wave of the Industrial Revolution. And it took an entire century, a shift in criminology there and the application of modern statistical data analysis to finally bring his ghost to light.
The math caught him.
If nothing else, it proves that the data always remembers, even when human society forgets. The math eventually catches up.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. Something to really mull over long after you finish listening to this deep dive.
Just something to keep you awake.
Think about the core lesson of Paul Mueller. He exploited the cutting-edge new technology of his day, the Transcontinental Railroad, to achieve perfect anonymity and geographical invisibility. He weaponized the new infrastructure that normal people were using to build a better life.
Which forces us to look critically at our own era. We are living through an infrastructure explosion that absolutely dwarfs the railroads.
Exactly. Think about today's hyper-connected, massively decentralized, wildly expanding digital infrastructure.
The internet.
What new, unseen blind spots exist right now, in this exact moment? What kind of modern predator is currently hiding in the scenes of our own rapidly expanding networks, using the vast, dark anonymity of the web, just like Mueller used the anonymity of the rail?
It's a terrifying thought.
We cracked the rural isolation of America wide open with steam and iron 100 years ago, and a monster slipped through. Now we've cracked the entire globe open with fiber optics, artificial intelligence, and limitless data.
The new frontier.
You just have to wonder, who is currently riding those invisible tracks, waiting for the criminology of the future to finally notice their pattern?